be taking us through some of the issues that are part of this electoral process. And one of those is the broad-based economic empowerment and what it means for South Africa and what difference has taken place over the past 20 years. I'm joined now by Keith Livingston. He's CEO at EconoBEE, and Stefan van der Vault. He's head of corporate finance at Bravura. Gentlemen, thank you, and thank you for finding time to come. Have you voted, by the way?
Not yet.
Not yet? Are you going to vote?
There wasn't time beforehand. I will definitely do so afterwards.
Are you going to vote?
Most definitely.
Are you going to vote?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So you're not listening to the voices that have been saying, guys, let's not vote because there's nothing to vote for?
No, I think it's an important process, so I'll be there.
Absolutely. I
There
salute
is certainly
you,
something to vote for.
I think there's definitely something to vote for. Even if there wasn't something to vote for, I think people must get into the habit. It's a duty for every South African to vote. Let's talk about BEE. It's been one of the key policies that have been implemented by the democratic government since 1994. And some people would argue that the way it was implemented has not been right. Some would say there's been a real difference that has been made. So let me begin by asking for a review. First from you, Stefan, and then I'll come to you, Kit.
Yeah, I think the introduction of the codes, which has been with us now since 2006, has resulted in a lot of focus being placed on empowerment by companies.
Have they worked?
It has worked. I think there's been a lot of problems with the implementation of the codes. I do think a lot of good has come from the codes.
Yeah.
And companies are starting to see it not just as compliance, but starting to also see the strategic benefit of complying with the codes.
Why are they difficult to implement?
One, I think the codes are quite complex. You really need to understand the different dynamics of the codes.
Yeah.
And people has looked at the codes, definitely in respect of the old codes, within the 7 respective elements.
Right.
And I think the main advantage with the codes lies once one can start to integrate those different elements into a holistic policy within an organization.
Yeah.
But it's a mind shift, it's like any legislation, first it's a tick box approach.
Yeah.
And then after that, once you've accepted it, people start to look at ways in which they can use the legislation to their advantage as well.
Absolutely. Keith, please come in.
Yeah, I think that we need to realize that BE is not the golden bullet that is going to solve every single problem that we have in this country. In a way, it's a small policy. I'd love it to be a far more important policy than it is. And as Stefan said, it only came into effect a couple of years ago. The Act itself was passed in 2003.
Yeah.
The first codes officially came into being in 2007. That is, about 13 years after the new democratic government came into effect in the first place. So we should maybe make a difference between transformation and the BE codes of good practice.
Yeah.
For the first 10, 12 years, government was maybe quite confused about the whole process of transformation. The fact that we need it is, without any doubt, I don't think anybody disagrees that we do need it.
Yeah.
But it's taken a long time before the BE codes, which are the first objective measurement of transformation, actually came about. And I think one of the questions we're going to ask is, has it worked or is it working?
Absolutely.
And it is absolutely working where it is being applied.
Yeah.
It currently only applies to business. Government doesn't follow it themselves.
Yeah.
There are other acts that take precedence in some cases, such as the Mining Act.
Yeah, but of course the complexity has created an industry on its own, which I suppose in one way is good, but in some ways also makes it harder for particularly small companies to implement. But when you review, let's get out of the technicalities of BEE and the codes and all those other kind of things. When you review the good or bad it has done, what did you say, net? Are we better off?
I say we are far better off. When we looked at our statistics originally back in 1994, we really didn't have that terribly much transformation. White people owned 90% of the economy. White people were in 90% of the top jobs.
Yeah.
That has changed quite dramatically. The Commission for Employment Equity reports every year, and we're seeing an improvement. We obviously want to see a bigger improvement, but it is certainly improving. There is the black middle class, the emerging black middle class, which I don't think would have arrived without some form of transformation policy. We say it hasn't done enough, but it has certainly made a very big difference to many people's lives, and I'm thrilled for that.
Yeah, we need to pause a little bit now, but when we come back, one of the questions I'm going to be asking is, when do we end it? We need to have an idea when BEE will end, so people can just wake up and go to work. Gentlemen, let me come to you, Stefan. One of the questions I asked, as I said, when we come back is, I want to understand when we end BEE? Or do we only begin talking about ending BEE when we have, okay, as you said, fully understood the codes, and secondly, made some kind of meaningful difference? But at what point?
I think there would be a need for a sunset clause in the codes. Would it need to be very soon? I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we haven't made enough progress as yet to really start to talk about when the end is. I think the codes always envisaged almost a 10-year review period. There was a lot of speculation whether that's going to be the end of the codes or not. I think we are strongly of the view that it won't be. I think which is also evident by the new codes that has been issued.
Absolutely.
And I think it is just a very long process. Things like management, for example.
Necessarily so. Should it be so complex? Because I'm thinking simplistically, I mean, I'm a journalist. What we try to do is to write as clearly as possible. If you want to effect change at the ownership level, at the management level, or at whatever level, need it be so complex as to require arms and teams of lawyers to decipher and implement?
I don't think it needs to be that complex. But as it's usual in business, there's always loopholes, there's always different ways of doing things. And you need an objectively measurable criteria for companies to be measured, especially because the codes are being used in procurement processes. So you need a fair benchmark for companies to be assessed against, and that's probably the need for the complexity. But ultimately, if companies are doing the right thing, they will find that they don't need to look at the complexity. They will almost start to automatically get the score that they want to get. You're
watching our special coverage of the South African election in 2014. In between, we are trying to get into the field and see what's happening. We're hoping we'll be able to cross and see President Jacob Zuma casting his vote. But Keith, come in.
Yes, I actually agree with what Stefan said, his last comment. It isn't that terribly complex, those codes. They sound complicated and they're a big wad of legal paper, but I find that in one day I can train somebody to fully understand most of the important parts of the BEE code. So they sound complex. I think they become complex because they become an emotional issue to many people. And when you look at it purely objectively, as Stefan said, if a company does the right thing, they spend time and effort training their staff. They contribute to corporate social investment, or what is now called socio-economic development. They make sure that everybody does what is really good corporate governance and nothing else. They are automatically compliant.
Okay, so if we look on our screens, we've got President Jacob Zuma casting his vote. I wonder who is voting for president. Any guesses, guys? Do you think he wants Julius back? You potentially could well be. That's the president of South Africa, President Jacob Zuma. He is casting his vote, and that's part of the elections coverage that we're having here on CNBC Africa of the 2014 elections in South Africa. In between, we're talking about some of the issues that are important.
The amended BEE codes were introduced to encourage transformation, but this has not succeeded as well as it should have. But before we get into some of the reasons with Leanne Livingston, CEO of EconoBEE, BEE advisory firm, here are some of the thoughts expressed by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa about the scorecards. He was speaking at the APSIP Investment Summit on Transformation.
The issue of scorecards. I'm a farmer, and as a farmer, I'm trying to apply for a water license. Kingola application, I want a water license because I want to irrigate a patch of my ground. They asked me my BEE credentials. But give us your BEE credentials. I am black as they come. So the application of this could actually serve as a barrier. And this is one of the issues that needs to be raised. Or this, as you apply it, could be a barrier. Is this what we meant to achieve? Or did we mean that we want to apply it as a transformation tool for white-owned companies? And I think that's what it was meant to do. It was not meant for when I apply for a water license, they must spend 6 months checking whether I've got a rating agency. That's exactly what they said to me. Or I must go and be rated whether, I'm black enough to apply for a water license.
Well, Leanne, thank you so much for joining us. It seems like there's a lot of problems when it comes to the different BEE codes that we have, especially for the sector. So each sector has its own BEE code that it has to follow. But talk us through some of the shortcomings that you have seen coming through with regards to these codes.
Sure, definitely. So one of the biggest problems is that there are these different sector codes. Now, with these different sector codes means that if a company follows a sector code, Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about the agricultural industry, that company would have to follow the agricultural scorecard. Now, the problem is the amended codes have been done and have been amended correctly back in 2013 and draft in 2014 in a final version. This has not happened with the majority of the sector codes. So you have some companies who are following an old scorecard, and you have some companies who are following the new, more strict amended BEE codes.
So looking at the BEE codes, I mean, is it really a question of implementation then, or is there an overarching, I suppose, area in the policy? I mean, there's been a lot of criticism, that it's been a very targeted policy and it hasn't resulted in a broad-based upliftment, and that in that way transformation has failed. What would your opinion be there?
Exactly. To some extent, the old scorecard was absolutely brilliant. Companies were able to get a good scorecard. They were able to look at the broad-based aspect, which looks at skills development, enterprise and supply development, as well as obviously ownership. But when the amended codes changed, what tended to happen is companies were saying, this is now too difficult for me to comply. So they've sort of stepped back and they've said, I'm not going to comply. The added complexity of the sector codes coming on board, not being aligned to it, just causes quite a lot of confusion. Right now, we've got companies who are saying, should we follow the ICT codes? They've never followed it before, but should we follow the ICT codes? Because that is actually an old scorecard, which is much easier. I can easily get to a level 4 on the ICT codes, which is, as I say, old, whereas on the new scorecard, I would get to a level 8, which hugely impacts the rate of transformation.
Leanne, this is Bonnie in Nairobi. Obviously, BEE has been hailed in admiration and criticism in equal measure across the continent. But is this a case of over-regulation or segmented regulation, really?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in South Africa, we've got a lot of different laws that companies need to follow. I mean, we've got our Employment Equity Act, we've got skills development, we've got our tax regulations, and added on top of that is BEE. I can't really comment on whether we need all of this legislation or whether it's going to be removed, but there's a lot of overlaps. And I think that a lot of companies are in a difficult situation because they need to comply with so many different laws and regulations, and sometimes they don't end up doing that.
And Leanne, in your view, how can stakeholders chart a way forward and perhaps draft a common vision so that we are all on the same page here?
Exactly. I think that's so important. I mean, as I've mentioned, there's already the complexities of the legislation and the differences with the sector codes. I think what should have happened is back in 2013, when the codes came out in a draft format, I think that all of the sector codes should have been repealed and then should have been re-gazetted as they come through. To put that into perspective, the first set of legislation came out in 2007, with the first sector codes coming out in 2009, followed by a couple more in 2012. It takes some time. So what I think should have happened is it should have all been repealed, which has already happened with construction and chartered accountancy. But I think everything should have been repealed and then introduced slowly as and when it comes through.
It's interesting. So, if I look at it, I mean, I was reading the misery index the other day, which I think South Africa scored, second worst after Venezuela. And I mean, they're basically unemployment times multiplied by your CPI rate to get the index. How much impact do you think BEE is having on unemployment? Is there any way that you guys could quantify, the impact that this has in terms of unemployment? Would we actually perhaps be better off without BEE because of increased hiring, that in turn resulting in increased skills and experience for people?
I think we must just come back to the reasons why a company does get a BEE certificate. One of the biggest reasons is when your customers ask you to get a BEE certificate. One of the other reasons, as mentioned in the clip earlier on, is when you are applying for licenses. So your gambling licenses, liquor licenses, and of course your water licenses require the government department to potentially look at your BEE certificate. The last reason is if you do any government business. So those are the reasons why a company would choose to get a certificate. Their implementation of then getting the certificate can be done in many ways. As we've discussed, it is broad-based, so we're looking at many different elements on the scorecard, and companies can choose to do more skills development, which I think is a great method of doing BEE and doing transformation really well, enterprise development and so forth. I don't think that it is a good idea to simply hire somebody for the sake of hiring. It isn't what is required in terms of BEE. A better strategy would be do your skills development, promote the person from within with the required skills. At the end of the day, you want to make money out of the business. You're in business to make a profit, and that's what should happen. Your BEE decision should make business sense, and your business decisions should make BEE sense.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Leanne Livingston, CEO of EconoBEE, a BEE advisory firm.
Well, to discuss, we're now joined by the CEO of EconoBEE, Keith Livingston. Thank you for joining us, Keith.
Thank you,
so let's look at today's clarification. You say the impact is quite dramatic. Tell me about that.
The impact could ensure that many companies who have broad-based black ownership schemes or employee ownership schemes could lose their BEE status. This could affect a lot of companies, some very large companies, as well as a fair amount of smaller companies.
Is it a curveball? Did business not know this was coming?
It's a really interesting question. It's something that we didn't know about. There was no indication whatsoever. But in the DTI's defense, they have been encountering a lot of problems with broad-based black economic, broad-based schemes itself and employee ownership schemes, in that unfortunately far too many of these schemes are a sham. They don't impart any true ownership to the black participants. So that might be the reason why the DTI has undertaken this. It's a fairly harsh activity, because some very good schemes are included in the bad ones as well. We would far rather have seen the bad ones thrown out, and there are bad ones, they deserve to be thrown out, but some of the good ones deserve to be given the award of the points that they deserve.
Well, tell me if you agree. I'm quite sympathetic because I was once part of an employee share scheme, but the company used it to pay out bonuses, which I noticed was linked to my salary anyway, not to the actual value of the shares. You don't take those shares with you, you can't trade them. It did feel like a scam.
That's exactly how we see it. If you were given shares or awarded shares and you don't have the true, what the DTI calls voting rights and economic interest, there is really no real ownership. If you were given bonuses as a profit share in lieu of salary, and a company regards that as being their black economic empowerment ownership scheme, do you really have ownership? As far as I'm concerned, ownership means that I own the shares. I have the right to sell the shares at some point in the future, maybe not right now. I can vote on the shares and I get true value in those shares. If the share price goes up, I want to get the profit. If the share price goes down, well, we're going to lose maybe, but that's what I see as true ownership. And there have been, as we indicated, quite a lot of these schemes that were done purely to award points. It is a curveball because nobody knew it was coming, but it's about time that the DTI did clamp down on such an activity.
Okay, so you're being understanding about this. Others, consultants and the like, are saying it's draconian, very hard for business to adjust, but at least businesses have a year anyway to adjust, because the old scorecard still counts for a year. Is that correct?
Well, the clarification that the Minister issued could indicate that this particular clarification around broad-based schemes applies as of the date of the issue of the clarification, including on the old BEE scorecard, which can still be used to some extent, which could indicate that a company hypothetically wanting to be verified in July of this year, August of this year, would still have a problem with their ownership scheme. The problem with the ownership scheme is, as we said earlier on, a lot of the good companies and the good schemes are being thrown out together with the bad ones. We'd far rather the good ones retain the benefit that they deserve to have.
Okay, if there are substantial ownership right schemes. So what do you think will happen if this impact is pretty wide, if a lot of big companies are relying on these employee schemes to help their scorecard? Will there be pushback, or do you think these businesses will just have to scramble now to change things?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a bit of a pushback. I also tend to believe that the Minister is going to be pragmatic, look at the issues. We ourselves are going to put in a submission, as will lots of other people, and that will hopefully explain to the Minister that what he has done in that particular clause is actually a mistake. It shouldn't be there. He shouldn't even be allowing those bad schemes to be awarded any points on the scorecard, not even 1 point and not even 3 points on the scorecard. There should be no points if it is a bad scheme, if it doesn't meet the definition of a black natural person, which is the legal definition of a human being, a black natural person having true economic interest, true ownership. And I use the word true, which might have a separate definition, but we know what true ownership does mean. The person does have the full rights to his shares, as opposed to some of these schemes that simply say the beneficiaries of our company or our shares are black people or black matriculants. And nobody is really defined, and after a while the black matriculant passes and the shares automatically pass, or what we call float, to another person. Nobody ever really gets the true benefit of those schemes. So I would like the Minister to change that particular clause in line with something that is slightly better and in line with what the true substance of the code says.
Okay, so you're actually saying government hasn't closed all the loopholes, because the whole point of these new codes was to close every loophole, so you couldn't have fronting and you couldn't have these sort of empty BEE schemes.
Yeah, I don't think he's closed the loophole whatsoever. There's so many ways of getting around it. Amongst others, you say this isn't a broad-based scheme, but it is a trust. And you have the exact same unfortunate bad instances, but because it doesn't meet the definition of a broad-based scheme, and the Minister didn't talk about a trust as well. With great respect to the people who designed this particular clause, I think that was a bit of a gut reaction to various problems that they've seen. I wish they would have looked at it in a lot more detail and really closed off these loopholes in the way it should have been.
All right, so it looks like this is going to progress for some time, this legislation. At least the underlying motive is good. And thank you for your analysis there. That was the CEO of EconoBEE.
The answer appears to be very easily. So why is the system so easy to wrangle? Well, either it's a system too lax or perhaps one that's too bureaucratic. Keith Levenstein, CEO at EconoBEE, joins us now to shed some light on just what we're looking at here. Keith, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start off by taking a look at just how rife fraud is when it comes to the issuance and the holding of economic empowerment verification certificates in South Africa Incorporated.
I think it's very rough. We tend to use the word invalid certificates rather than forged or fraudulent certificates, and I tend to find that around about 5% of all certificates I see tend to be invalid for some reason or another. So it is fairly rough. It shouldn't be happening.
5% seems like a minimal percentage given the bigger picture, but the fact that the verification industry players say they come across at least one fraudulent or invalid certificate a week begins or begs the question, why is it so easy to access that kind of certification? Because it talks to the entire qualification process, doesn't it?
Yeah, that I think tends to be the biggest problem. Certificates get produced either by an accredited verification agency or an URBA approved agency, and it gets put out to the particular company who uses it with regard to their suppliers and their customers. What doesn't happen is there isn't a central registry of these certificates. So I might see a BE certificate that looks all right and it looks completely correct, but it actually isn't. And there's no real way for the average procurement officer to take into account if that certificate is fraudulent, if it is correct, if there is something wrong with it.
So what's the problem? It's the back office and the systems that need to be rectified or put in place adequately to support this entire initiative?
I would certainly say that that is one of the solutions to the problem. Let's have a central registry. It is something that the Department of Trade and Industry is supposed to be doing. They should have a database of all certificates so that we could all go to a central place and check whether that certificate is valid. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened. which is why we've tended to manage our own database, and that's how I tend to come across many certificates that are invalid or fraudulent or forged, because I look at certificates over time, and I can see one certificate that was issued in 2010, and it's the exact same certificate with the date change to 2013.
What does the department say the problem is, or the challenge is, to actually getting adequate systems in place?
I don't know. I think that it's just the usual problem of government having to go through a long-winded tender process and other processes in order to get this up to date. I do know that the Department of Trade and Industry's B unit is under pressure. They've got a lot of work to do, and I don't think that they've got sufficient staff to handle all these issues. And of course, there are two different regulators. There's the SANES themselves, as well as IRBA, the audit body. So with two different processes in place, nobody seems to want to take ownership and responsibility of these particular problems. Obviously, I believe that it is only the Department of Trade and Industry who should be managing the whole process, but it doesn't tend to happen sometimes.
The onus has to be on the business or the company itself as well to follow, the right route. Econo is one of the companies that's been recently highlighted as one that's, challenged or put to the fore fraudulent certificates. They say that their credentials are very good. They'd have no motive to falsify the certificate other than saving on cost. I mean, what's the cost of such an exercise?
There are two costs involved. One is to become compliant. So for a smallish company, they've got to do a little bit of work with regard to their employment equity, which isn't really a cost. They've got to spend maybe some money on skills development or enterprise development, but those costs aren't really very big for a smallish company. And then the actual process of getting that verified certificate could be in the region of between 8 and 14 or 15,000 rand for a smallish business. It goes up to maybe millions for the large corporates. So it's not a lot of money, but there is work to be done, and there's maybe the hassle factor is possibly why some companies do this instead of going through the proper channels.
Should it be this costly, this cumbersome an exercise?
I don't think it's too expensive an exercise to go through. If your company's annual turnover is 20 million rand and you're asked to spend, say, 10,000 rand per annum, it's less than the cost of one employee. So I don't think it's an unreasonable number. Obviously, it is an extra cost, so I recognize that the bottom line is always important. But I don't see that it is too onerous a cost.
So not enough to get a company or warrant a company to cheat the system. We've had the Department of Trade and Industry last year to promise in having any company with fraudulent certificates blacklisted from government business. The follow through there, have those repercussions been felt?
I personally haven't seen very much. I will, as a be a professional, I see it as my duty, and the Act specifically makes it my duty to report every single problematical certificate to the department. In fact, I report them to the various sector councils as well. And I have to say that I get very, very little feedback, other than an acknowledgement that there is a problem. Not terribly much is done. In many cases, nobody seems to know what they can do, and we all seem to be waiting for the B amendment bill to be signed by the President, which eventually will cause up to 10 years in jail time if you're found guilty, and 10% of your company turnover. But even that is going to take many, many months or years before a B commissioner is even appointed. So in the meantime, it seems to be a little bit of a free-for-all.
Yep, so in the meantime, with all of that being the case, if you're looking at these fraudulent certificates, it brings to question BEE and what it in reality achieves at the end of the day. What's your assessment of BEE credentials being struck and the aims and objectives behind the entire initiative being met at the end of the day?
I'm somebody who is very positive towards transformation. I want to see it happen. I know the reasons for it, and I think it is helping many, many people. At the same time, I sometimes get very dejected when I see various companies shunning the system in the way that they do. But in general, I think that BEE should be working if it is applied properly. People should be benefiting, and they are benefiting, and many, many companies are doing some really good work. With regard to empowerment, with regard to charitable work, etc. But yes, it does unfortunately call the whole process into a little bit of question if too many companies can get away with it. The biggest problem, if you get away with something, it means that you could be losing out on a deal with your customer because somebody else's invalid level 2 is better than your very good and genuine level 4. And I don't like seeing companies losing business.
And those are real issues that we have to contend with and deal with right now. Of course, talk of the new BEE amendment bill planning to assist in terms of authorizing imposition of legal penalties. We'll of course be tracking this story as it unfolds. Keith, thanks so much for having joined us. Keith Levenstein is CEO at EconoBEE.